This video is sponsored by Squarespace.
What's your thinking? What's your plan now? Concept or otherwise?
No, I think it needs to be much more radical.
Well, I think it's safe to say, wind the clock back a year and a half and the idea of Mercedes being arguably the fourth best car on the grid would have sounded pretty ludicrous. New regulations always throw up some surprises though, and Mercedes has been one of the biggest, but not in a good way. As Toto said himself, radical change is now a necessity, so what happens to Formula One's most dominant team of the modern era, and can they really get back to the top? Because it looks right now like a long way off. Because with increased competition at the sharp end, could things only get worse? Let's talk about it. How dominant have they been? Quick history lesson for the Brackley-based team first and foremost. Originally founded by Ken Tyrrell as Tyrrell Racing, the team set up shop back in 1958 with its biggest period of success in the late 60s and early 70s, delivering all three of Jackie Stewart's world titles, including one Constructors' Championship to boot. Their last season as Tyrrell would be in 1998, with Ken selling up the team to businessman and close friend of Jacques Villeneuve, Craig Pollock, becoming British-American racing, achieving 12 podiums over 7 seasons from 98 to 2005. Honda came on after the first season as engine supplier and slowly began to assert authority in that team, eventually taking control ahead of 2006, renaming it to Honda Racing F1 Team. They managed to win that first season, plus a couple of P3s, all for Jenson Button. However, 2007 and 2008 were way less successful. They were right at the foot of the constructors table. Now, to what extent Honda realised that they built an absolute rocket ship for the 2009 regulation shake-up, we'll never really know. But citing the global financial crisis at the time, Honda decided to pull the plug on the project, with team principal at the time, Ross Brawn, swooping in to save the team, keep everyone in a job and keep that car going, which wouldn't that have been a travesty if that car had just been binned off? A car that would go on to win the 2009 World Championship with Jenson Button and the constructors with help from Rubens Barrichello. Mercedes bought the team in 2010, bringing back Michael Schumacher out of retirement alongside Nico Rosberg. Then Lewis Hamilton joined in 2013 ahead of a regulation change that would signal the start of Mercedes' dominance from 2014 onwards. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 and 20 all saw both the drivers and constructors titles going to a Mercedes, the 21 constructors as well. 8 constructors titles in a row is the world record, ahead of Schumacher with 6 in his Ferrari domination, double that of the 4 that Red Bull won with Sebastian and the 4 that McLaren got back in their glory days in the late 80s, early 90s. But as we all know, domination in any sport with any team breeds content, breeds jealousy, disdain over time. That domination will never last forever. It never does. So to go from 8 seasons of winning and winning and winning to be arguably the 4th best car on the grid based off what we saw in Bahrain anyway, not to mention a country mile off of Red Bull, who are well clear, not just of them, of the rest, of everyone. That's going to be one hell of a difficult pill to swallow for the team from Brackley. Do you fancy a website this year? Websites are great if you want to set up your own online shop or blog. Doesn't really matter. Squarespace is the perfect place to build your very own online home. For me, I use it as kind of half portfolio from my graphic design work, but also to sell any merchandise. I sold my pins, my posters, and tickets to the Aldas and Tommo live show, which sold out. Happy days. It's a breeze in Squarespace for me, I don't have much patience with technology. I'll give you that. Squarespace makes it easy enough that actually I can do it. Best thing of all though is you can try Squarespace completely free of charge. It's only when you want to put your finished website live to the world you have to pay anything. So when that time inevitably comes around, head to squarespace.com/TommoF1 to get 10% off your very first website or domain. A flawed philosophy, or was it worth a punt? Because then we come to these new regulations, and when we saw the Mercedes come out in 2022, it looked an aggressive interpretation of the regulations for sure, and remains in 2023 the most distinctively shaped F1 car on the grid. Not only the 0.5 side pods, whatever you want to call them, but the very distinctive kind of shoulders on the car that run back from the halo, and from what we've heard anyway, the underfloor is a different philosophy to what most teams have typically gone with. They've gone in a different direction, Mercedes. Which, Ferrari and Red Bull have gone in different directions. There's 2 different directions there. Mercedes have gone in their own direction. Williams started following them at the start, arguably, but certainly haven't continued that way. Now, do I begrudge Mercedes for going down an aggressive concept? I think, you have to roll those dice and take those risks if you want to fight for a world title. You kind of go in all or nothing. You can't afford to play it conservatively if you want to really be at the sharp end. And of course, in hindsight, it's clear to see that that was the wrong direction. But look, at the end of the day, Mercedes has to back themselves as the team that for 7 consecutive seasons built a car that was clear of Horner and Newey and their Red Bull. As well as everybody else, even the Ferrari challenges in 17 and 18, Mercedes still were able to deliver a package that over the course of a whole season outperformed the rest. Now, last year, the Mercedes excuse was that they couldn't run the car low enough to achieve this theoretical performance because of the bouncing/porpoising phenomenon. That was preventing them from reaching the potential of their car. However, this season it feels like porpoising isn't so much of an issue. They've obviously raised the ride heights, they've raised the floor edges, yet even now without the porpoising, the Mercedes just doesn't seem to be anywhere near Red Bull on pace. Now look, I know my limitations, okay, I'm not an engineer, I am a fan with a big mouth at the end of the day. Couple of recommendations if you want to get more insight on the old engineering stuff: Kyle and Blake, give them a watch. Ex-Mercedes Aero engineer, ex-Red Bull performance engineer. But I think the moral of the story is this: it's the importance of having the best technical team and the best minds out there. From the technical chief downwards, that is the spine of the team. It doesn't matter how good your drivers are. It doesn't matter how big your budget is. If you don't have the right minds in the right place, creating the right design solutions, you're going to come up short. I'm sure Red Bull have gone down development dead ends, right? Everyone makes mistakes. We're only human. I mean, remember the side pods that Aston Martin rolled out at the start of last season? That was obviously a waste of time in hindsight, but they didn't allow it to define their season last year. They still recovered to be, at least 6th quickest car by the end of the year. And look at where they are now. They've absolutely nailed it. So can Mercedes recover? Again, if Aston Martin can go from 9th best car in Bahrain last season to 2nd best car in Bahrain this season, then as much as that's going to be demoralising somewhat for Mercedes, it also shows that you can turn it around, you can recover in this cost cap era. And it certainly shines a light on teams like McLaren and Alpine, who have talked a big talk of, we're going to get to the front eventually for a long time, and never had a step up anything like Aston Martin have just achieved. It does make them look a little bit silly. But a significant factor in Aston Martin's success was addressing their shortcomings proactively and quickly. We know that they did already have this other side pod philosophy cooking in the background. If they'd have gone with that in the first place, imagine where they'd be now. But they also hired Dan Fallows as chief engineer, so I guess having that carryover, you're hiring him for his knowledge, and he's just come from Red Bull. They've got the best philosophy going. Adrian Newey's apprentice. It was a match made in heaven, and it's paying dividends now. Everyone's questioning Mercedes' philosophy as soon as that car rolled out last season and it started bouncing around like crazy, especially after like Baku, for example, when it almost destroyed Lewis's back. However, the car they've rolled out in 2023 is an evolution of that. It's not going in a different direction. It's the same direction, just more in that direction. Now, is this partly through ego, a reluctance to scrap what they've already got to essentially copy the route of another team, a more successful team right now? Maybe if they'd addressed and made as drastic a change as Aston Martin appeared to when they saw that their side philosophy wasn't working, maybe they'd be in a better place now. It's very difficult to say, because where Red Bull and Ferrari and Aston Martin can now all refine the philosophies they do have, Mercedes have to spend resource changing their philosophy completely before they even get an opportunity to start to understand it. I think that's more likely where the reluctance to change came from. They felt that it's a better use of our time to try and really understand what we've already got, rather than changing what we've got and then trying to understand that from scratch. But it looks like that hasn't paid off. Because remember, we're in the cost cap era. It's not the days where you could spend out of this kind of hole. You could chuck money at a problem. You could chuck hundreds of millions at building this other concept on the side. You can't do that these days. I mean, the big teams like Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes are running at less than half the budget that they used to. And if you find yourself in this development black hole, then you're going to get punished more for it. Whether that's writing off a chassis, whether that's bringing upgrades that don't work, or whether that's running a fundamentally flawed car philosophy. And could this lose them their drivers? Because it's not so much that I think Mercedes is going to fall into a Williams-esque black hole here. It's more to do with fighting for a title, because I think they've got two drivers in Lewis and George who, given the right car, can 100%, I've got no doubt in my mind, they can both fight for a world championship. Now, obviously, Lewis has won 7. However, there's no guarantee George is going to win 1. He might have the ability, but there's countless drivers over the history of the sport. Even you look more modern history, Juan Pablo Montoya, Robert Kubica, Mark Webber, Felipe Massa. These were all drivers who had the talent, but just weren't quite able to get the job done. And look, I don't see George going anywhere. I think he will still believe in the backing of Mercedes. They've got the Daimler, big corporation money at the top. As much as this is a bump in the road, they are the kind of team, they have the facility, they have the infrastructure, they have the name and the clout to dig themselves out of this hole for sure. The question is, can Lewis? Would he be satisfied with getting odd podiums for 23, 24 and maybe even 25 before the big regulation shake up in 2026? Which, you know, if I had to put money on it right now, I'm looking at the good momentum of Aston Martin, I'm looking at Ferrari building on what they already have, and I'm looking at Red Bull dominating this sport right now. Do I believe that Mercedes are going to overcome this before we get to 2026 and fight for a world title on merit? No, I don't. Drivers like Fernando, drivers like Sebastian, drivers like Lewis are not going to be content fighting for top of midfield, odd podium. I'm sorry, these are born winners. If they're not fighting at the front, if they're not scrapping, they're going to lose motivation to carry on quickly. And it's whether Lewis has faith that Mercedes can turn this around quickly enough to give him a shot at winning an 8th world title. And the thing is, Mercedes made a decision to bring in George Russell. So even if they give him that car, George is going to want that championship as well. And from what we've seen, George can go toe to toe. I mean, look at the numbers. George is all but there on Lewis's level right now. That is another problem for Lewis. He could be in a whole Hamilton-Rosberg issue going forward, which was fine in 2014 when they were miles clear of the rest, but it's the odd point going down to a title decider maybe in 2024 with Verstappen and Alonso, Leclerc and Perez and Sainz and whoever. Like, that's a difficult sell. It's going to take a lot of things outside of Lewis's control to fall into place for him to get that shot. That's what I'm saying. Because on top of that, there's the pressure from behind. Alpine have long underperformed on their expectation, but you cannot forget that they are a manufacturer. They build their own engine. They can have that control around the power unit that a lot of other teams can't. They've got two fantastic drivers in their lineup, in Pierre and Esteban. That is only going to add motivation of Allez le Bleu, surely. Not to mention that based off Gasly's race pace in Bahrain, they could arguably be closer to the top 4 than they are to the rest. If he wasn't starting P20, it would have been really interesting to see Gasly's pace relative to the front lot. Then you got Audi, who could be on that Sauber car as early as next season, given the Alfa Romeo deal expires at the end of this. Seidel's now in charge of building that team up for the big German manufacturer, big rival to Mercedes, to come in, take the reins. That's going to give internal inspiration for the team to push on and perform, and that's going to give external pull for bringing in talent, not just drivers, but we've seen from Aston Martin, if you can sell a dream, you can bring in big personnel from other teams and it can work. Eric Blandin from Mercedes, Luca Fabato from Alfa Romeo, and Dan Fallows, like we've already mentioned. 3 big hires that came with that Lawrence Stroll money in Aston Martin. AlphaTauri look to be possibly up for sale, and even if you don't get a team buying that finds a base and moving in, if there's a 600 million buy-in that's being spoke about at the minute to enter Formula 1 and divvy out between the teams, it might just be worthwhile buying AlphaTauri. And if it's a big player like Porsche or Honda or Hyundai, why couldn't they do what we're expecting and anticipating Audi might do in F1? There's no reason why not. Look, the point is, there's good arguments you can make of most teams in F1 that they can and have the potential to fight up the front and potentially fight for championships in the next few years. So the more competition there is, the more it's going to be difficult for Mercedes to stand out and give their drivers cars that can comfortably fight ahead of the rest. I think hopefully every single season is going to be a 4, 5, 6 car fight, which would just be incredible. So what now? Because for what it's worth, which is very limited, again, I'm just a fan. I'm not an engineer, but I do my best to understand the sport as much as I can. What do I think Mercedes should do now? How do they strategically optimise their short and long-term future? So they finished 3rd in the constructors last season, which means they get 80% of the ATR allocation, aerodynamics, wind tunnel, all that, for this season. 75% Ferrari, and then like 62.5% I think for Red Bull with their penalty that they're serving. Although Aston Martin, they were 7th in the constructors last year, which means they get 100% of the ATR time, and look how good that car's already looking. That's pretty ominous. Now Mercedes do build their own engines, which of course is a pro, and they control how that power unit integrates with the rest of the car. So for me, I say This 2023 car, development in this direction needs to stop as soon as possible. If you've already got stuff that's pretty much developed, if it's going to be minimal resource, just get it stuck on the car. Try and optimize what you can. Try and learn what you can. You've got to throw the kitchen sink at a completely different philosophy for next season, surely. Because it sounds like Toto's already thrown in the towel with this direction, and he's going to be telling engineers be radical, like he said, which it was kind of radical thinking, you could argue, that got them into this place in the first place. Maybe it's less radical, more tracing paper effect that's needed now. Look, I'm sorry, these cars were always going to converge eventually, and it's just like Mercedes were the last to get the memo about the convergence. There's clearly two directions that work, but the Red Bull one is the one that teams have throw most resource behind. Will that Ferrari big curvaceous side pod philosophy last the test of time? Maybe it won't. I wouldn't put it past Ferrari to not be getting the most out of that, and therefore actually that might be the better philosophy, but we'd never know because of their incompetence. But we'll see. Maybe this Frederic Vasseur era will come good. And even if Mercedes finish P4 in the constructors this year, even lower, you know, at the end of the day, with these financial regulations, yes, you won't get the full prize money. They've got Daimler, Ineos, Toto Wolff support. You know, they're not anywhere as in need of that money as a smaller team would be. They can profit more, I'd argue, you know, 12 million less in prize pool, but 5% extra ATR time. If you're changing your car's philosophy completely, every percentage is, in my opinion, going to count for exponentially more. Is it all as doom and gloom as Toto Wolff has made it sound? I don't think so. Again, they've got the strongest driver pairing in F1, I think. And Bahrain's very tough on tyres. I think they'll do a better job relative to the field in Saudi Arabia. And that is a really strong end to last year as well. They won, you know, Brazil and polled it on Hungary and had opportunities to fight towards the front. So, yeah, I just want to see it competitive at the front. I don't really give a toss which teams are up there. I mean, Williams and Albon would be nice, of course, but that might be pushing it a bit. But what do you think? Where are Mercedes at? How did they get there, and how do they get themselves out of this little bit of a mess they've found themselves in? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, notification bell as well if you like what I do. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.